Hey Brad, how's it going?
Oh, good. How about you?
Good. Hello everyone, and welcome to Calling for Change. This is episode 5, Voter Suppression. My name is Erin, and I'm with Lincoln Calling. And as you know, I'm here with my partner Brad from Civic Nebraska. Brad, have you been hanging in there? It's been wild times.
Oh, yeah, no, been hanging in there and I've been looking forward to this conversation we're going to have today. It's about voter suppression, which obviously shouldn't exist, but it is a very interesting subject and something that I obviously, in my role at Civic Nebraska as our voting rights field director, deal with a lot. So I'm super excited to have this conversation. Originally, John Cartier was going to be with us. He's our director of voting rights at Civic Nebraska, but he had something come up. He couldn't make it. So I actually get to introduce some really awesome people who I've worked with on a variety of things. I'm joined by Bridget Claiborne and Candid Villard from the League of Women Voters. They're amazing, the league, and then Bridget and Candid. And then also one of my favorite people, Margaret Marsh. She's one of our voting rights field organizers at Civic Nebraska, has joined us as well. She does this really awesome historical look at voting rights called The Long March Forward. So we got some experts here, so I'm excited to soak up some knowledge today.
Wonderful. Welcome, everyone, and thank you all so much for jumping on this conversation. We're super excited to hear about all of your knowledge bases and your expertise. I'm wondering if you could all introduce yourself, maybe share with us a little bit about what your role is in your organization, and also share with us either, what inspired you to get involved in this type of civic engagement, or tell us a little bit about your pathway. Bridget, can we start with you?
Sure. So my name is Bridget Claiborne, and I serve as the Vice President for the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha, which is the local league for the Omaha area. I've been in the role for a little over 6 months, but I've been involved with the league pretty much my entire life. I always say that I'm a third-generation league member. My great aunt was a member, and then my mom was a member, and we've all took turns serving on the board. So it's really that sense of duty, I think, that brought me back to the league when I moved back to Nebraska. But what's been really exciting in the last few months, actually, is that we were able to hire our first ever full-time employee with Candid being on staff. So I'll look forward to her introducing herself. But I mean, the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization that's been around for 100 years since the passage of the 19th Amendment. It was formed sort of in anticipation of the 19th Amendment as a way to help millions of women carry out their vote, being new voters. And we have been active. Our chapter in Omaha has been active since the 60s, and we have a pretty well-known voters guide, but I think our lesser-known activities include a lot of our GOTV efforts, voter registrations, voter education, and we are going to be doing even more of that now that we have Candid on board.
Yes, ditto to everything Bridget mentioned. Hello, everyone. I'm Candid Villard. I am the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha's league administrator, and I've fell in love with this organization because I found it during college. I was actually an intern starting out, just interested in voter rights, interested in law, interested in reshaping better communities. And I just happened to find the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha through connections around town. And it's become something that has perfectly emulated some of my own goals. And when we talk about goals, we talk about the league's goal of empowering citizens to shape better communities worldwide and, being present and aware of the things that are happening within our democracy. And so those are the amazing things that I love about the league and why I'm here today.
Thank you. How about we go to Margaret next?
Yeah, I'm with Civic Nebraska's voting rights team, and I'm a community organizer for Greater Nebraska. We have chapters throughout the state that work on voter registration, voter education, and of course, we also have our advocates call and write letters based on a lot of our issues. I've always thought civic engagement was really important. I was a single mom for a long time. I had 5 jobs at one point. So there wasn't much chance for me to be really engaged in civic activities. So it's like once my kids flew the nest, it was like, now it's my time to step up and, represent and advocate for people who are unable to, but who care about those issues as well.
Wonderful, thank you. Brad, why don't you
yeah.
give us a little bit of a reminder? How did you get into this work too?
Okay, so I got into this work. I'd been volunteering and doing different things like that, and then I got approached about working on a campaign. I was like, yeah, that would be great. So I did that, and I did another campaign, and then one of the things I'd realized working on campaigns is like so many people aren't engaged, so many people aren't participating before you get to that step of voting, and there's so much more that needs to be done with that. And I really wanted to figure out a way to do that, and also to make sure that on the campaigns I'd worked on and the issues I cared about, like everyone who should be able to vote is able to vote. And so that kind of led me to Civic Nebraska to do the work I'm doing now. And one of the things I always say is the reason why, just at the very base level, why I care anything about civic engagement is because of my mom. And when I was a kid and when I would get in trouble, she would make me write essays on different civil rights leaders. And during that time, it just illuminated for me like the importance of voting and just engagement in general, whether you're protesting, testifying at your city council or state legislature. If you want to see change, you got to be the one to go make it. And that was just something I learned at a pretty young age. So that's why I'm here. And here we are, and we're 62 days away from the election. Margaret, you work with me, so I know you have been dealing with the same things, the stress, and just like the election is coming up, and we have everything to do in the next like 2 months. And Bridget and Candid, I'm sure at the league, y'all have been dealing with the same thing. One of the first things I did once I really, really started becoming involved in politics and just in being civically engaged was join the League of Women Voters. That's one thing I always try and remind people is that anyone can join, anyone can be a member. I'm a member. That's one thing I'm super, super proud of is being a league member. So you guys want to tell me, Margaret, Candid, and Bridget, just a little bit about like what y'all are dealing with right now? Because I know for me, it is crazy.
Well, to piggyback off of what you were saying about just the league being open to everybody, one of the things that we didn't say is that the league's vision is really that we envision a democracy where every person has the desire, the right, the knowledge, and the confidence to participate. So right now, I feel like we are working on all 4 of those things, and they kind of are interdependent in a lot of ways. Maybe Candid, you can talk a little bit about some of the GOTV efforts, but also the ways that we're supporting others in our community who are doing voter registrations as well.
Definitely. And so as Bridget mentioned, we do a lot of voter registration around the Omaha area, as well as major efforts within phone banking, through text banking, sponsoring messenger voting kits. So when organizations are interested in doing voter registration around town, or not necessarily organizations, but entities, community volunteers, community members, whenever they want access to whatever materials they would need, we would supply them with a training video and any materials such as the voter registration form, etc. And so working on things like that is definitely keeping us busy right now.
I think probably, I mean, we all knew 2020 was going to be a challenging year, but that was before COVID hit, and that has complicated all of our work. Our canvassing efforts, we were going to be doing a lot of door-to-door voter education and voter registration, and all that has had to move to phone canvassing and voter registration. That's a new challenge. How do you get people registered when you have to remain, 6 feet apart? So there's just a lot of additional stress that's been thrown into 2020 on account of the conditions that now we're all working on.
Definitely. And one thing I just have to say and shout out right now is the fact that over the time of this pandemic, Margaret has become like the digital organizing expert. Like, she's the person who, whenever I have a question with something as far as reaching people online, I turn to. So I just had to give you your props, Margaret, because you have been absolutely killing it with digital organizing. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the compliment. Yeah, so you can teach old dogs new tricks. That definitely can be done. So don't be afraid of technology. It is your friend.
Definitely. So
Can I bring up one other thing, Brad?
for sure.
Because we didn't mention anything about our voters guide, which I feel like is kind of our just most well-known thing that we do. So the League of Women Voters Greater Omaha produces a voters guide that's specific to Douglas and Sarpy County. And I believe that we are actually going to be doing printed copies. We didn't end up doing one in the primary due to COVID, but we are planning to do it for the general election. Candid, you can share after I'm kind of done, if you know sort of where we're going to be distributing those. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that we have that voters guide available online at vote411.org. And the state league, the League of Women Voters of Greater Nebraska, actually took it upon themselves this year to expand the races and the candidates that they're reaching out to. And so they've done every single down ballot race across the state, which was a huge undertaking. I believe that they're still working on trying to get some of the responses back, but both at the local level and the state level, we've really made it a priority to get people information about candidates on both sides for all down ballot races, which I think is huge. And hopefully, as people have more time working on their ballot while they're voting from home, Vote 411 becomes even more widely used.
Definitely, especially as you were saying, like, so many of us are going to be voting by mail in this election, which is super, super important because it's a great way to vote. It's safe and it's secure and it's easy, but also like it stops you from having to risk being in a very populated place, which is a polling place, to cast your vote. And you can do it at home. You can have the League of Women Voters Guide open as you work through your ballot. And that is something that I love that guide. That's something I rely on, like, especially for all those offices that are lower down on the ballot where I'm like, I don't really know anything about this. And the League of Women Voters Guide really lets me just be able to like get some quick, like, nonpartisan information about it so that I can make my decision in an informed way. So no, yeah, thank you guys at the League for doing that, because it's amazing. So the first question that I have for this amazing group is just, you want to tell us a little bit about the history of voter suppression and all the ways it's happened, because there's so many ways. One way that I've always been super interested, and part of the reason why I came up to Civic Nebraska, is the fact that people with felony convictions in Nebraska can't vote until 2 years when they're off paper. So done with probation and parole. And that's actually like an upgrade from where it was, because for a long, long time, up until about 2005, it was a lifetime ban. And we think about who that affects and the communities it affects, particularly the Black community, and how just hurtful it is to have people in our community who were banned just forever from voting, especially knowing the history of where that comes from, the fact that it comes from slavery, and wanting to make sure that nothing changed coming out of slavery. And so that's one like very specific way that the vote has been suppressed. And we talked about that a lot in our last episode. But what are some other ways where the vote is being suppressed? And if you guys also just want to kind of let us know, like, what does it mean when people say voter suppression? Because that's another thing. Like, you hear a lot of voter fraud, voter suppression. What does it all mean?
Well, I think when you talk about voter suppression, it's important to know that from the get-go, we intended the vote to not be for everybody. When we first we first enacted the Constitution, right from the start, it was only men who owned property who were allowed to vote. And it took quite a while even for white men who didn't own property to get to participate in elections, So then we finally, gradually we roll out the welcome mat to different groups. But even as we're doing that, we keep rolling it back in. So we finally, passed the 14th and 15th Amendment to prevent race from being an issue, to prevent people from voting. But then at the same time, then states adopt constitutions that implement poll taxes and literacy tests and are creating barriers specifically designed to keep people of color from voting. We have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which basically won't even let them become citizens. And that doesn't even get repealed until the 1950s. Women don't get the right to vote until 1920. States still had on the books laws that prevented Indigenous people from voting as late as the 1970s. So it's like roll the mat out and then yank it back up from under someone's feet as we go. So it's a systemic problem that was there at the very onset of our democracy.
Definitely. And one of the things you mentioned that I always find interesting is like the date where it was supposedly established, like this group can vote, but then like the just extreme huge time period between then where people have like the practical ability to vote and are able to actually exercise that versus just the date on the books where it's happening. Like it's allowed now.
Right. And then it goes deeper into not just people, but then the sexes, right? Mm-hmm. Of what separates men and women's suffrage movements is this huge gap that you're talking about. I mean, like I wanted to go ahead and pull out the dates just so that we know what we're talking about, right, guys? So men were voting way before, like within the 1800s, and Black men kind of, not Black men, but specifically African-American men, were getting the right to vote as early as 1870s. And so when we actually think about one of the biggest suppressions that happened in history, we definitely look at the women's suffrage movement, right? And why the League of Women Voters even exists. It exists because in the 1920s, white women were able to vote, but it didn't take until 1920. It didn't take until 1924 for Native American women to vote. It didn't take until 1943 for Chinese women to vote. And then it didn't take until 20 years later into 1965 for Black and Latinx, women to have that right to vote. And it's not even just talking about having the right to vote, but actually going and being able to vote, because we all know the voter suppression that happened physically for many women of color, specifically Black women, when it even came to wanting to have a voice within their democracy, within their community, and what happens to them when it comes to legislative things of that nature. So the history is just such a key factor in pointing out which groups have been the target of voter suppression and how it's still happening. You think that in 1965, Black women were getting the right to vote, or starting to at least, but yet Black women today still think they can't vote because of incarceration laws. And so, or myths, I should say, around those who have been incarcerated or in prison, I should say. And so it's so important to look at the history.
Definitely. And a piece of the history I always have to highlight is the fact that Black women led the civil rights movement in everything, like, but the public image of it, and the fact that they did all that work and still weren't even truly able to appreciate that right. It's just ridiculous. But yeah, Bridget.
Yeah, well, Candid, thank you for telling everybody those dates. I think it's just a really good reminder, and especially this year marks the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and so we've been thinking a lot about what that legacy means and knowing who was left out in 1920 when that happened. One of the things that I was thinking about, though, is we have all these dates, we have all these milestones, we have policies that do suppress votes. We have voter ID laws. We have all of these things that are directly tied to voting rights legislation. But I think especially when it comes to women voting, there are other things that affect them getting out to the polls or voting period that would not be considered voting rights issues, but that are, in my opinion. And I think that's part of what the League aims to do too, in terms of getting involved in other public policy issues like access to childcare, like paid family leave. These are all things that affect people's everyday ability to take off work and go show up at their polling place. And I think it's really important that we think about voter suppression holistically like that, because even if it's not explicit and doesn't fall into a policy category for an organization like one of ours, it's all connected and has to do with really not only the ability to vote, but barriers getting in the way of people exercising that agency. And I think I've been thinking a lot about, okay, voting is one of the ways that I exercise my agency, but in terms of if my day is jam-packed, like, is it going to be the first thing I do? It is for me, because that was how I was raised and I have access to do that. But I mean, like Margaret said, I'm not a single mom. I don't have a million other things on my plate that are disallowing me or making it harder for me to go do my civic duty.
Absolutely. I mean, there are just so many barriers put in place. And like you mentioned, Bridget, some of those are legal barriers and some of those are societal barriers. And I'd love for you to be even more explicit about what those things are. And I invite the rest of you all to talk about this, but you've done a great job of laying out the history of voter suppression in this country. But what are some of the more contemporary examples that we're seeing of voter suppression or barriers that are being put in place, things that we're seeing, that we've already seen in 2020, things that we're anticipating for the general election, things that we've seen in 2018, 2016. What are some more contemporary voter suppression tactics that y'all have seen?
Well, of course, there's voter ID, which just even the fact that it's become so common to talk about whether your state has a voter ID law or not, a lot of people perceive that it is a requirement to vote no matter where they live. In Nebraska, of course, we do not currently have a voter ID law. That's a fundamental, it's even why Civic Nebraska exists, was for that very purpose. Nebraska has a very strong constitution to protect voting rights. So we're lucky in that aspect. But the fact that it occurs in so many other states means that there are a lot of people who have the misconception that it is a requirement anywhere you go, that you need an ID to vote, which that puts a lot of people at a disadvantage, you know, whether it's difficult for them to get to the DMV. In rural Nebraska, a lot of times the DMV is only open one day a week. And, you know, it could be an hour's drive for a farmer who's in the fields to even be able to get there. It disadvantages elderly people. Just the fact that it has become so common to even talk about, I think, is how fundamental a problem it is.
Definitely.
Go ahead, Brad.
Oh, I was just going to say, like Margaret mentioned, we do have some really strong protections in our state, which is what has allowed us to stop voter ID from coming into our state, because what our Constitution says is there shall be no hindrance or impediment to the right of the elected franchise. And what makes that so great is that the only really way that voter ID can be done is if it's done in a way where it doesn't hinder anybody's right to vote, which it's never been shown to be able to do that, because it always ends up hindering someone, whether it's someone who's homeless, so they don't have an address to match with the ID, whether it's someone who just, honestly, one of the things people don't think about is you get your driver's license every 10 years, and if you don't look like how you looked 10 years ago, it could hinder your right to vote. So it's one of the things, one of the pieces of our Constitution, which also has like some things that need to get out of there. Like we still have exceptions for slavery in our Constitution, but we do have this really strong protection for the right to vote. And it's one of the most incredible things about Nebraska, and that's why you don't see voter ID in Nebraska, because there is that really strong protection that, look, it can't be a hindrance for anyone at all, and if we do it in any type of way, it can't be a hindrance, and that kind of defeats the purpose of it, because it's created to be a hindrance and to stop people, Black and brown people, and just a wide variety of people from being able to use their elective franchise. And we just have a line in our Constitution that prevents that. So it's really a blessing. It's one of the good things about living here in Nebraska.
Right. And I also just want to echo the fact of, like, when we're talking modern day voter suppression, we're also talking about the people that are fighting against last minute election day barriers that maybe your elected official all of a sudden announces. Or we're also talking about people or community members within the LGBTQ plus community who may feel discriminated against when they're arriving at the poll, and maybe their ID doesn't match what they're presenting themselves as. And we're finding different areas of discrimination that were not as blatant because of the time period that we're in, because of such of a progressive time that we're in. We're running into different forms of discrimination that we never had to deal with, but now we do. And so when that comes to, even extending into people waiting hours to even vote because there's a low amount of poll workers in the certain polling place that they have to go to because that's where their district is, all of these things are what's causing it. And even when you go into organizations or jobs not allowing their employees to take off early and or have the day off to vote, these are all tactics. So
yeah, one of the things I think that we haven't mentioned too is especially in the context of COVID and vote by mail, some of the misinformation and kind of fear mongering around the safety of voting by mail. And I think that it's definitely a tactic of voter suppression just to, in general, be concerned, because we know that fraud with vote by mail has never happened in the state of Nebraska. And I'm really appreciative for what Civic Nebraska has been doing on that front, and also really glad to see our election commissioners and Secretary of State take vote by mail really seriously in this election. But obviously, I think that the conversation is not just here in Nebraska about voting by mail and people's fears with it. It's something that's happening across the country, given the state of the world right now. But maybe, I don't know, Brad, whether you could talk a little bit about what Civic has been doing with vote by mail, and just, I guess, in general, whether just talking to some of the misconceptions about it.
Yeah, so what I would say with vote by mail, the number one thing I would say is that vote by mail means you get your ballot by mail, not that you have to return it by mail. And a lot of the concerns that I've been hearing, that I've been talking to people with, has been, okay, everything with the post office, I'm hearing this, I'm hearing that, what should I do? Like, when do I need to send it in to make sure my vote is counted? But it doesn't have to go through the mail. And that's the thing I've just been reminding people. You can take your ballot to a drop box, or you can take it straight to your election commissioner or your county clerk. And I think that's the big thing. And if you have your ballot and you don't have a way to get it to a drop box or get it to your county clerk or an election commissioner, but you don't feel comfortable putting it in the mail, reach out to Civic Nebraska, because we will help make sure you're able to get your ballot back. The other thing, like with vote by mail, it's like, well, I want to vote by mail, but I don't have stamps to send it back. Don't have to mail it back. There's those different options. I think that's the big thing that people should really understand is vote by mail really only means that you get your ballot by mail, but you still have so many options on how to get that ballot back. And if you're still really hesitant, but you don't want to wait in long lines at the polling place, we have in Nebraska in-person early voting. It starts 30 days from the election, and you can just go into your county clerk, your election commissioner, and just vote there in person. And it's an awesome option if you're like, I don't know how I feel about vote by mail, but I also don't want to end up at a polling place waiting in line. You'll have 30 days. You can go in early. You're not going to end up in the line unless you're trying to go like the day right before the election, because then there might be a line. But that's another option. And I think it's one that kind of gets overlooked, but there is early in-person voting. So that's something that I would also just encourage people to do. But if you are going to vote by mail, every deadline that you see, whether it's requesting your ballot, when to send it back, all of those things, don't even come close to that deadline. Because the fact of the matter is, Nebraska, we're not a postmark state, we're an in-hand state. So what that means is with anything you're doing, whether it's your vote by mail request, whether it's your actual ballot, it has to be to where it's supposed to be on time, not just like I put in the mail 3 days before, so I've done my job. No, that's not how it is here in Nebraska. So I would just tell anyone who's looking at those things, like, don't look at those actual deadlines. Like, realize that things can happen, and you don't want the reason why your vote doesn't end up counting is that like somebody was running late that day or something like that. Like, beat the deadline, do it way ahead of time. It's like they tell you with your homework, and I never listened then. I always was doing my homework, like sitting in my chair as class is about to start. But don't do that with your ballot. Like, your ballot is way more important than any homework I've ever done. So take it seriously, do it early, and get it turned in through the many ways you have the ability to turn it in.
Brad, one thing that I really appreciate that Civic Nebraska has been doing is you have done some social media campaigns creating what's your voting plan. And making it social and saying, okay, this is my voting plan. Here's the pathway. What path are you going to take to voting? Are you in person? Or are you vote by mail? Are you going to actually send it through the mail? Or are you going to drop it in a drop box? What's your path? What's your plan? And then to combat us procrastinators, because I'm with you on that, Brad, creating an accountability plan and saying, okay, I live in a house with 3 other people. We're going to sit down together and make our plan together and make sure that none of us are creeping towards that deadline. We're going to get it done well ahead of time, which is against my nature, but I'm going to do it.
Definitely. And I do want to have Margaret say something, because like you were saying, living with other people, having that ability to hold other people accountable to making sure they get it in. Margaret's been doing this really cool activity on our volunteer platform called Triple Your Vote. So I want to give her a chance to talk about that so that she can get some more people trying to triple their vote?
We've been using since COVID struck, and we had to come up with new ways to engage with our advocates. We have Outreach Circle, and you can access it from a PC, or there's an app you can load onto your phone. And we have all kinds of different actions that are on there. And one of them that we have is called Triple Your Vote. You just have to look for the blue vote donut is the picture that goes with it. I like donuts, so I use that. But anyway, so you basically commit to have three of your contacts that you're just going to engage with throughout the election process. We have reminders that you can send, like, hey, you should be, ballots are being mailed today, so be watching your mail because you should be getting your ballot at home. Then we have, we send a reminder before the deadline to get your ballot turned in. We send a reminder before the last, day to register. So it's a good way to try and just kind of get three people that you care about to try and get them engaged in the voting process. So, so it's Outreach Circle, and there's lots of different things on there you can do, but Triple Your Vote is one of the actions that we have up at the moment.
I love that. And I really appreciate how you're framing it as action, as so many of us are stepping into activist work, maybe for the first time. A lot of people look at voting and say, okay, I know I need to vote, but there's so much more action around voting that can really be done. And tripling your vote or creating this action circle, really broadening your reach with the voting tool, I think is really important to underscore. I wanted to just kind of circle back to this conversation about voter suppression, because one topic that I haven't heard y'all talk much about is purging of voter rolls. And I know this is something that we hear happening in other states. Maybe one of you could tell me about what that means, and are we in danger of that happening here in Nebraska?
Well, in rural Nebraska, where I primarily work, it isn't a huge problem. Most of our election officials are pretty diligent, but you should never assume that your registration is okay. And it's very easy to go to voter check and just check to make sure your registration is current and updated. Sometimes there is a little bit of a lag if you're using like the DMV to register and when people process through. So it's always a good idea to just check, to just make sure.
Have we ever seen
Definitely.
anything like that here? Sorry, you go ahead, Brad.
I was just going to say, I would second Margaret in the fact that it's always just best to check. You are relying on, a system and everything in that system to go right. And one of the things we've seen specifically with people who have felonies, who are out of their 2-year waiting period, is sometimes they'll go to register and then it'll still get kicked back, like, oh no, they're not out of it, and they'll reach out to us and we're able to help them with that. But anything that's totally reliant on just everything going right, it's always best to double check. So anyone watching this, whether you've been registered and voting for the past like 30 years, or it's like your first year and you registered to vote, just before that deadline, just double check. It takes almost no time at all to check. You just put in your name and your voting address, and it'll tell you whether you're registered or not. And I'd recommend that for anybody. Like, I have been a registered voter since I was 18. I've been voting in elections, and still before that deadline, I just double check, because if anything were to happen and I wasn't able to vote, that's going to be an issue. And people would see and hear about on Facebook Live like they're watching this, because I would be very, very upset. So it's something you can do online. It's easy. It's free. If you don't have access to a computer, you can call your local election official and just ask them, and they will be able to tell you whether or not you're registered to vote. And that's something I would just recommend everybody do. regardless of anything, because we haven't seen a lot of big purges or anything like that in Nebraska, but I don't think there's been a year I've done election protection where someone hasn't called and said, hey, I should have been registered to vote. I thought I was registered to vote, but they're saying I'm not. And so then we'll double check on our end to make sure it's not an issue and they won't have been registered, whether they haven't voted in so long that they were removed, or, they thought they sent their form in, but it never actually made it in, all those different things. It's just easiest to just take some time before the deadline, a week or two before the deadline, just double check, make sure your registration is in there and that it's up to date.
Absolutely. So are there any other things that as we think about voter suppression, maybe we can think about an explicitly Nebraska context? Is there anything else we should be mindful of, that we should be watching out for?
Were you going to say something, Brad?
No,
I was gonna tell my story about my grandma voter suppressing me at the polls in 2018. Because I know one of the questions that we're going to get to is like, what's like the role of the citizen or the individual in all of this? And I kind of hate that we've been talking about how so much of the onus is on the individual, right? To go make sure you're registered, to make sure you change your address. Like, you have to do a lot as a voter to be diligent. And I think what I was going to say in terms of voter suppression is like knowing that you can advocate yourself the day of at the polling place too, and in general throughout the entire process. No, you don't have to, and you're probably not going to have all the information in the world about voting rights. And that's okay, but I think like you can advocate for your right to be there. It's a right. Brad always says it's not a privilege, it's a right. And I think going into it with that attitude the day of is really important. I've been a voter involved in civic engagement my whole entire life. I feel like it's just like in my blood because, like I said, I'm like third generation at this. Like Brad, I can't imagine a world where like my mom wasn't teaching me about how important it was to show up to the polls. That said, in 2018, I've been voting. I voted by mail really since like college because I lived away for college and I was voting by mail. And so that was really comfortable to me. But when I moved back to Nebraska in 2018, I requested a vote by mail ballot. But then I wanted to really bad to go vote in person, partly because I wanted to vote for my best friend growing up's dad. He was running for Public Service Commission, and I just wanted so many of us want to go to the polls and do the thing and get the sticker and take the selfie. And like, that's fun. I wanted, like, now that I'm back, I'm like, I want to do that. I go show up at my old elementary school and it's fun. Anyway, because I had requested a vote by mail ballot, I showed up. And I wasn't on the log because I had requested a vote by mail ballot. Now, fun fact about this story is that my grandma always works the polls, and she was working my polling place and was the one checking to see if I was on the like register to be there. And so she's like, well, no, like you can't be here. Like you just need to go drop your vote by mail ballot off at the, at one of the drop boxes. Like, I can't let you do this. Like, couldn't get my sticker, couldn't get any of it. So of course, I listened to my grandma because she's my grandma who says no to their grandma. So fine. Like, I didn't get my selfie. Maybe I did take a selfie and pretended like I did it, but whatever. I went and dropped my ballot off in the drop box. But what I didn't realize, and I think Brad or somebody else told me after the fact, is that like, let's say I accidentally threw my vote by mail ballot away, or like I never got it. Like there was a legit reason why I showed up at my polling place to vote. What she did, turning me away, well, I would consider technically voter suppression, because what should have been offered to me probably is a provisional ballot for me to fill out that day, because they would have known that I never sent in my vote by mail ballot. So I think not that that's going to happen again, I doubt it. But if it did, like what I would know differently is that like I should have advocated for myself to get a provisional ballot. And I think what I'm going to tell, like what I tell people in general is like, know that you can ask for that. Again, should it be on the individual to have to advocate for themselves? Like in an ideal world, no. Like, I think anybody working the polling place should just make that happen for anybody that's not on the register to be there. But still, like, again, I feel like I know a lot about civic engagement and about voting, but that still happened to me. And I think that piece of it is really important, the self-advocacy, and kind of also, I think voting sometimes gets a bad rap for not being as like radical or cool as an activist thing to do. But I think when you approach it with that attitude of like, I'm standing up for myself and my right to do this, and it's important, that it becomes something a little bit more important, or that it can. And it's important to approach it that way, because otherwise you do run into, you could get voter suppressed by your grandmother.
We don't want that.
No, we don't.
Definitely. Bridget, I would say, yeah, everyone has that option for a provisional ballot. It's called the ballot of last resort. So it's kind of that backup. You did request a vote by mail, and if you had it, I would encourage you to vote that way, because provisional ballots do have to go through those extra steps. But no, I'm totally glad that you end up being able to vote. But like you said, you ended up actually still having your vote by mail and just being able to go and cast that ballot. But had you not have, that wouldn't have been a vote that would have been counted. And I'm also very glad that on that Mike's race that you were so excited about to vote in person. Mike is one of my favorite human beings in the world, and he is also part of our voting rights team. And before he was part of our voting rights team, he ran for office. But yeah, there are like rights we all have as voters here in Nebraska. And there's 5 I usually like to highlight, and I'm going to read them to you guys so I don't accidentally skip one. But you have the right to receive a ballot. So like Bridget was saying, like if she had gone there, she has the right to get a provisional ballot. And it goes through extra steps to make sure she hasn't already voted, but she has that right to cast a ballot, or to receive a ballot. The next one is the right to cast one. And where that really comes in is if, you get to your polling place, the line's out the door, and it's 7:58, and there's 15 people in front of you. If it turns 8 o'clock, which is most closed, you can still vote if you were in line. So not only do you have the right to get a ballot, you have the right to cast that ballot. And the hours the polling place is open is from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Central and 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Mountain Time. The next right is the right to privacy. You can cast that ballot in private, and you don't have to tell anyone who you voted for. If you're like me and you run your mouth a lot, you'll probably tell everybody, but that's totally a personal choice. So that's something that's super important to remember. The next right is you have the right to vote free from intimidation, whether, that's, posters that are for some reason up in your polling place, or, someone standing at the door of your polling place saying like, vote for this person, that person. That's not allowed. Electioneering, any of that stuff isn't allowed within 200 feet of your polling place where you're voting. So know you have that right. Know that there should not be a police presence at your polling place. That's not something that's allowed or okay. You have the right to vote free from intimidation. And then the final right we already kind of touched on, but here in Nebraska, we don't have voter ID. And the only exception for that is if you're a first-time voter and you sent in your voter registration by mail. So you sent in the form by mail and you didn't include your any type of identifying document. But that's the only exception. It's such a small group of people. So anyone, if you've ever voted before in Nebraska and you're going to vote, know that you don't have to show any type of ID. And if you do hit that small group of people, an ID, what's required identification is not what you would think of. You don't need a state ID. You don't need a driver's license. You can do it with like a bill from a bank if it's got your voting address and is dated within 60 days. So those are like 5 rights that we have here in Nebraska that honestly not everyone has all 5 of those rights throughout our country, because elections are state to state things, which is one of the interesting things. But yeah, that right to receive a ballot, that provisional ballot is super, super important, because there will be a lot of people who do like spill their coffee on their vote by mail. And just know that that doesn't mean you won't get a vote.
Right. Well, we have just under 10 minutes left. I want to ask one more question, and then I do want to make some room for some questions that we're getting from Facebook. I do want to just recognize, the fact that what you said, Bridget, that there is such an onus put on the individual to advocate for themselves in this voting process. But there are also organizations. So maybe you all could kind of paint a picture, what can we as individuals do to advocate for our right to vote, to advocate for other people's right to vote, to make our advocacy is intersectional, and how can we kind of find those organizations that we know will advance policy that will expand voting access for folks? What are some of your thoughts and recommendations?
Well, I would say something that I was just thinking about is the perfect remedy for voter suppression is advocacy or voter activation. And when I think of what Civic Nebraska does and what League of Women Voters does, the main key factor of what propels our organizations is that we are constantly urging people to advocate for themselves. And so when we say advocate for ourselves, we're talking about, speaking up within movements happening in your city, or contacting your local representatives, making sure that your voice is heard, because casting a vote is one thing, but to change a society or to make democracy truly work, you have to fully act out as a engaged citizen. And so if that means showing up with a, sign that shows your support in something, it's all a part of this bigger mechanism of voter suppression. Because when we silence those who are activated, and when we say activated, we're talking about the people who are at protest, we're talking about the people who are texting their friends, their 3 friends to vote, we're talking about, all of these people volunteering to do voter registration. When we silence those people by telling them protesting is bad, or, oh, stay home, don't go to the poll in line, when we do things like that, that's our modern day suppression. And in order to combat it, we have these great organizations such as ourselves that are, being here to be a resource. And so my biggest call to action is to get interested. When you get interested in things such as politics that have always seemed to be more on a higher pedestal, you become less interested in what it takes to actually have a good world, because it just seems so far off, and only the people with money talk about that, and et cetera, et cetera. So when we urge ourselves and have these great organizations such as ourselves that are activating people and forcing, or not forcing, not say that, but encouraging people to get more involved in their communities and encouraging people to know what's going on a legislative level, that's how we're really fighting voter suppression.
That makes me think of a little bit. One of the things that we observe in elections is that it's the presidential election every 4 years. It gets so much attention, but local communities are so important. Your local elections determine what happens to you on your day-to-day lives. Whether your roads are paved. I mean, it's basic stuff. What your kids are taught in school. So it's important to show up for those elections. And I think also an act of civic engagement is just even subscribing to your local newspaper. They are really what keeps your local politicians honest. So I would also advocate that, pay attention and please support your local media. That's very important.
Great. I want to turn to audience questions now. We have a question. It is, how can poll monitors or observers help prevent suppression at a polling place? What type of commitment does that look like? Time, research, resources, etc.
Okay, so I will jump in on this one because Civic Nebraska does an election protection program. It's one of the things I love, and it really makes a difference. So, what that looks like is an hour of training and then going to the polling place. We'll assign you a polling place. We'll try and find one near you, and just being our eyes and ears. And then on the back end, I'll be there. John will be there. Some other lawyers will be there like him who know all the election law stuff. And so that way, if you're at that polling place and you see someone have an issue or you see them walk up and look like they're trying to vote and then they turn around, you're able to be there to help them, whether they turn around and it's because they're at the wrong place. You'll be able to be there and we'll teach you how to find their next polling place for them so you don't run into a issue where, okay, they came to one polling place, they got told another one, went to that next one, that still wasn't right. So now forget it. I'm not voting. I tried like twice and it didn't work out. Or you're there to make sure, no one's asking for ID. One of the most interesting stories I've heard with voter ID here in Nebraska, with us not having it, is that we had one polling place where there was an older lady and she was in a area that was super, super just diverse. And she had bad hearing anyway, so she couldn't hear the names. So she started asking for people's IDs so she could read it off and then compare it. But after, you see 6 or 7 people in the line, take out their ID. If you don't have your ID, you get out of line because it's oh, I don't have what I need. And so that was something that Civic Nebraska was able to step in and fix because we had an observer there and we were able to get on the phone with that county election official and be like, hey, you have somebody who's asking for ID. Even though they're not doing it in a malicious way, it's causing people who are able to vote to get out of line because they didn't bring their ID with them. So definitely, anyone who has time on election day, you don't even have to have your full day. If you have an hour, 2 hours, however much time you want to give us, we will appreciate it and we will take it. But we need people who are willing to go to polling places to make sure that their friends, their families, their neighbors, their rights are being protected, that they're not being turned away when they should be able to vote. And I'll just add, because it is a pandemic and not everyone is trying to go to a polling place right now, that we do have other options where you can help us with that. Even if it's just driving around to different polling places to make sure that the lines aren't getting too crazy long at any one location or anything like that. So if you want to get involved, if you want to make a difference on election day, definitely reach out to me, reach out to Margaret. Honestly, you can reach out to anybody on this call because they'll know who to put you in touch with. But reach out because we need people out there. There's Civic Nebraska, our voting rights team is 5 people, which is not enough to monitor any more than 5 polling places in Nebraska. So we really rely on the public and our amazing volunteers to make sure that we're able to help people and protect people's right to vote. So definitely volunteer. I'd appreciate it so much.
That's awesome information, Brad. Thank you so much. Now, I know we're going to go just a slight bit over. I'm going to ask everyone one more question. This is a question about the future. It's an opportunity for all of you to imagine. So I'm going to paraphrase someone's question, and it has to do with updating voting. And so what will voting look like in the future to you all? Can you imagine that a little bit? What will voting look like in the future? Will technology be involved? share with us a little bit about your imagination about voting in the future.
Well, when we think about technology, we often think of like our ideal technology that doesn't allow people to take our information and scam us. We're talking about like a secure and trusted interweb, right? And so when we think that way, hopefully we maybe can start infusing some technology into our voter practices. But definitely when we think of, like, I see the person's question of why it seems so archaic, we have to also think about the component of keeping voting as a standard and insecure. And so when we think about moving things over into the internet, there's just so many loopholes and instances of potential fraud that keep us from really revolutionizing, in a way, what voting looks like. But in an ideal futuristic world, I think it'd be cool to use an iPad, right?
I guess for me, in the future, I would like to see the 3 million U.S. citizens that live in our 5 U.S. territories who so far do not have any voting rights for our elections beyond participating in presidential primaries, that they would all be enfranchised and they would be joining us. That's what I see in the future.
Yeah, I'm with Margaret. My family's from St. Croix, from the U.S. Virgin Islands. So all my family who still lives there can't vote. And that's where I would like to get to the point, which I wish that wasn't what I was like dreaming of. I wish I could have like bigger dreams with voting, but like for us to not be putting obstacles in front of U.S. citizens and people who should have the right to vote to be able to vote, whether, yeah, it's people in the territories, whether it's people who have a felony conviction, any of those things. Like, my future would be us not moving closer to the past, which we've been doing since we kind of destroyed the Voting Rights Act in Shelby versus Holder. So if we can just like start like moving back to where we should be, like I'd be happy with that at this point.
Yeah, I think you all really covered it. I think we need to get to a place where we make voting easier, not harder, which can look like a lot of different things. But I think you're right. There's things to rectify before that can even happen. And I think that's really important.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for jumping on this conversation. Bridget, Candid, Margaret, we are so grateful for all of the wonderful information that you've shared. Everyone, please shout out to the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha and to Civic Nebraska. Utilize their resources, volunteer for them, sign up, become members. Let's all say thank you, and we will catch you at the polls or on social media as we share our voting by mail stories, however that's going to look too. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, y'all. Oh, dang. Everybody's gone. Have a good one.
What were you going to say, Brad? Is Brad still there? Maybe not. Okay, well, we are wrapped up for tonight. We will come back in 2 weeks. And we also just announced Lincoln Calling, which will be taking place October 1st through 3rd. We'll have lots of music and even more educational programming, including more calling for change and civic engagement programming. So definitely check out lincolncalling.com, check out our lineup, and join us for those programs. Good night, everyone. Thanks.